Hello and welcome to this video lecture on nonprofit information organizations. My name is Professor Tiffany Vino and I'm the instructor for SI 626, Management of Nonprofit Libraries and Information Services. This lecture focuses on nonprofit information organizations. In particular, we will explore the characteristics of such organizations, look at the size of these sectors in the U.S. economy, and explore some of the implications of nonprofit status and the unique characteristics of libraries and archives for their management. The learning objectives for this lecture are to be able to summarize the key traits of nonprofit information organizations and to be able to compare and contrast these with their for-profit counterparts. Additionally, you should be able to explain the critical role of mission in nonprofit information organizations. We will assess each of these learning objectives face-to-face in class. As we begin, please think about the kinds of organizations that you think will be covered in this course. In other words, what kinds of organizations do you think qualify as nonprofit information organizations? Let's pause a moment as you think about this and jot down some examples of nonprofit information organizations. Now let's look at the organizations that I have listed. For the purposes of this course, this slide shows the organizations that we consider to be under our purview. So we are interested in libraries, especially those in academic, public, special, and government settings, archives, including those in public, academic, and government settings, as well as those in nonprofit organizations like local historical societies. We're also interested in other nonprofit organizations, particularly those that have an educational or information provision mandate. Typically, these might include organizations like community networks that offer free computing, literacy organizations, and they might include organizations like cultural or environmental organizations that have some kind of educational mandate. Similarly, religious organizations or foundations might also provide education as a part of their mandates. We are going to emphasize these first three categories of organizations in this class. However, we will also draw some examples and cases from the other two categories, that is, cultural institutions such as museums and art galleries, as well as healthcare organizations like some hospitals, consumer health organizations, or professional associations like the American Medical Association. Now let's talk about the size of these sectors in the United States. As this slide shows, there are just under 120,000 libraries in the United States. School libraries, or those that are in elementary and secondary schools, make up the largest proportion of libraries in the U.S. Public libraries are the next most prevalent type of library, but as you can see, there are far fewer of them than school libraries. Just 3% of libraries overall are academic, that is, located at colleges and universities. Here we see a map of public libraries in the United States. This is based on data from the Institute of Museum and Library Services from 2010. And here, of course, we're looking at the continental United States. On this map, blue dots are libraries, and the darker the blue, the more libraries there are in a geographic area. As you can see here, there are public libraries across the United States. Their distribution reflects, to some extent, the distribution of the population in the U.S., with more rural states like Montana and Wyoming having lower library density. This slide shows the number of employees in libraries in the U.S. These numbers include only school libraries, public libraries, and academic libraries. As you can see here, school libraries have the largest number of employees, but this number is not a lot greater than for public libraries. Interestingly, academic libraries make up a larger proportion of employees than one might expect based on the number of academic libraries in the U.S. Recall that they make up only 3% of libraries, but this shows us that they make up about a quarter of the library employee workforce. Why do you think school libraries make up a larger proportion of the libraries than they do of library employees? And similarly, why do academic libraries make up a smaller proportion of overall libraries than they are a proportion of the library workforce? Take a moment to think about this. If you think that it's due to the size of the organization, you are right. School libraries tend to be small and to have 1 or 2 employees only. Academic libraries tend to be larger organizations since they serve larger organizations like colleges and universities. It would not be uncommon for academic libraries to have in the hundreds or even thousands of employees. For example, Harvard University Library employed 1,089 full-time equivalent staff members in 2011. These numbers do not include special libraries. However, it's worthwhile to note that there are 10,000 members of the Special Library Association worldwide, and their members are in 75 countries, but they were most from the US and Canada. Now let's talk about archives. Archives exist in a diverse range of organizations, some of which are listed here. This list is somewhat more diverse than the list of libraries. Like libraries, it includes all levels of government and educational institutions. We see, however, a greater presence of organizations such as local historical societies and religious institutions. With regard to where archivists work, these data are collected less systematically than for libraries, unfortunately. The last Society of American Archivists membership survey took place in 2006, and those are the data reported here. Here we see the kinds of organizations in which archivists were working in as of 2006. In these numbers, we see that the largest proportion of archivists worked in academic settings, so 43%. A quarter worked in government organizations, roughly, and just under a quarter worked in nonprofit organizations such as historical societies and religious institutions. Now let's talk about other kinds of nonprofit organizations. The nonprofit sector is a large component of the U.S. economy. As this chart shows, there were 1.5 million, more than 1.5 million, registered charities in the United States in 2011. This amount has been growing as well. In the last 10 years, between 2001 and 2011, the number of nonprofit charities in the United States has grown by 25%. Public charities make up the largest proportion of nonprofits. This includes everything from youth organizations to immigrant services to consumer health education organizations to organizations serving seniors or people with disabilities. Most commonly, nonprofits are private and are nonprofit in the sense of the Internal Revenue Code. They qualify for tax exemption under Section 501(c)(3) of the Internal Revenue Code, which states that the organization exists for public benefit. And some of the named categories include organizations that focus on health, education, social service, religious, cultural, and scientific purposes. In 2010, public charities reported over $1.5 trillion in total revenues and about $1.45 trillion in total expenses. Of that revenue, the largest proportion came from government fees and contracts and other forms of program service revenues. 73% of that revenue came from there. 22% of revenue came from contributions such as gifts and government grants, and 5% came from other sources like dues, rental income, special event income, and gains or losses from goods sold. Notably, in 2010, nonprofits accounted for 9.2% of all wages and salaries paid in the United States, which gives some indication of the size of this sector. Now let's talk about the public sector. The public sector is the part of the economy that provides government services. Typically, funds for such organizations come from taxation, primarily, as well as potentially user fees. Examples of public sector organizations with which you are likely quite familiar include organizations like law enforcement, firefighting, public roads and utilities such as streetlights, driver's license services, parks and recreation, public education, archives, and public libraries. The specific composition of the public sector depends on the country, and it does vary quite a bit internationally. But it may include actual parts of the government or government-owned corporations, as well as private sector firms that are contracted in some way to provide public services. While there are fewer examples of government-owned corporations in the United States, a good example from Canada is the electricity distribution company Toronto Hydro, which is an independent corporation that is nonprofit owned by the City of Toronto. It makes its revenue primarily from electricity fees from users, and it provides a profit each year to the City of Toronto. These type of organizations are also included in the scope of this course, meaning public sector organizations with an information mandate. Now let's have a brainstorm. Take a moment to identify 1 to 2 general characteristics of nonprofit information organizations, including libraries, archives, and other nonprofits, that might affect the ways in which they're managed. What do you think is unique about libraries and archives in particular? Now that you've had a chance to think about it, let's look at my list. Some of the characteristics about libraries and archives that are important are that most of them are, as this course would suggest, nonprofit and or public. There are some exceptions, but most of them do fall into this category. Most libraries and archives are also not autonomous organizations. Typically, they're within some kind of parent organization, whether it be a university or a school. Public libraries typically are the greatest exception to that. As well, funding allocation for libraries and archives, because they're mostly nonprofit and public, is often politically determined and often very explicitly so. So budget allocations may emerge from political processes like the work of city council. Libraries are also governed typically by specific public administration legislation, like tax and legal legislation. These are different legal frameworks than would be experienced by corporations. Now let's look at a few local examples that will show us how this works on the ground. Our first example is the Ann Arbor District Library. This library is a state government authority as per Michigan's District Library Establishment Act. In the Act, it states that, quote, "A district library established pursuant to this Act constitutes an authority under Section 6 of Article 9 of the State Constitution of 1963. This particular legislation also makes this organization tax exempt. As a government agency or authority, Ann Arbor District Library receives most of its revenue from property taxes. In a recent fiscal year, that proportion was 90.5%. However, Ann Arbor District Library is not just a public organization. It's also affiliated with a nonprofit organization. The Friends of the Ann Arbor District Library and Friends organizations, as you may know, are present at a number of public libraries throughout the United States. This Friends organization at AADL is tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. The Friends organization qualifies for tax exemption under this code because it's organized and operated strictly for educational purposes. Our next example is the University of Michigan. The university was founded in 1817, about 20 years before Michigan Territory officially became a state. So the university is actually older than the state constitution. The state constitution mentions the university along with others such as Michigan State and Wayne State. Section 4 of the Constitution states that, quote, "The legislature shall appropriate monies to maintain the University of Michigan and other universities named," end quote. Also, Section 5 describes the controlling board of the University of Michigan, including establishment of the regents and its scope of responsibilities. But the University of Michigan is not only a public organization. It's also a 501c3 charity that's tax exempt, and it can receive donations. Within the larger university, University of Michigan libraries are a subunit of that university, and the Dean of Libraries reports to the Provost. Now let's take a few moments to identify 1 to 2 general characteristics of nonprofit or public organizations that might affect the ways in which they are managed. Now that you've had a chance to think about what you think is unique about nonprofit and public organizations, let's look at some characteristics I've identified. One important characteristic of nonprofit organizations is how we think about success. Profit is the primary measure of success in businesses and for other for-profit organizations. So in nonprofit and public organizations, we need to look towards other measures of efficiency and effectiveness if we want to know if an organization is successful. Nonprofit organizations also, as we've already highlighted, tend to be tax exempt. This is not the case for most corporations. Nonprofit organizations are also not owned by shareholders. As we'll talk about later, they tend to be comprised of members and boards of directors. Also, nonprofit organizations and public organizations tend to be very labor intensive. As we'll see later in this course, human resources typically make up a large proportion of the budgets of nonprofit organizations, including libraries. Also, nonprofit organizations are often constrained in terms of the goals and strategies that they can pursue by their charters, as well as government or private funder guidelines or donor restrictions. As well, they often have different funding sources than for-profit businesses, which might be selling a product or a service. Instead, while there is a significant proportion paid for program fees for nonprofits, we also see different kinds of revenue like grants and donations. Something that's fairly interesting about nonprofit organizations is that they do tend to be dominated by professionals. We see physicians and nurses in hospitals. We see teachers in schools. We see librarians in libraries. We see ministers in religious organizations, etc. By and large, nonprofit organizations tend to be dominated by professional staff. Additionally, nonprofit organizations have very strong political influences, and this may include budgetary matters as well as who stakes a claim on the organization's activities and outcomes. Additionally, it's not very common for for-profit organizations to make use of volunteers, but this is a very common thing in nonprofit organizations, volunteers being unpaid people who provide unpaid services, primarily because of some commitment to the mission of the organization. Additionally, in nonprofit organizations, while there are governing boards, they're not linked to shareholders. They tend to be volunteers, they're not likely to be paid board members, and they tend to be less influential overall in the functioning of the organization. Additionally, governance models tend to be different. In nonprofit organizations, for example, organizations may vary, but there may be models where board members are very actively involved in service provision. As well, there may be a more kind of policy and governance model in line with the Carver model, which became all the rage in the 1990s. Additionally, nonprofit organizations exist because of a mission. They don't exist to make profit, but they exist for some kind of reason. That is the mission. So let's talk about the mission a little bit more. First, I'll direct you to a supplementary reading from week 1. It was called "The Mission is the Reason." If you want to find out more about the role of missions in organizations, how to write them, and how to use them more effectively, I strongly recommend "The Mission is the Reason." But first, let's identify a mission as the charitable purpose of an organization. The mission is the legal reason for the organization's existence. And that mission is tied to the organization's tax-exempt status under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. But as the authors of The Mission is the Reason argue, the mission's often a fairly underused resource in nonprofit organizations. And they recommend using the mission quite a bit more actively, in particular in the following ways: as an aid to management decisions. So, in other words, when an organization is trying to choose between options, such as where to allocate resources or which initiatives to pursue, it's suggested that the organization should ask itself which option best responds to the organization's mission. Additionally, a mission can be a very important way of motivating and attracting staff and volunteers because, for example, staff members in nonprofit organizations don't tend to be there for the money, unlike in the for-profit sector, perhaps. It is staff members and volunteers' alignment and support for that mission that becomes utterly critical. And this is something that can be used quite a bit more actively. Additionally, nonprofit organizations use their mission to secure resources, whether that be from donors or funders